I'm going to go ahead and start, and people will keep coming on. Thank you to everyone who's here already. We've got 8 already, because Mary Beth does have to hop off at 5 to 12. Goodness. All right. I'd like to introduce and welcome Dr. Mary Beth Beller, PhD. She's an associate professor of political science at Marshall University. She researches state politics and teaches American political behavior and institutions courses at Marshall University, in addition to courses in the Master's in Public Administration program, which she actually started a decade ago. Mary Beth earned her PhD in political science from the University of Kentucky. She also serves as the university's coordinator for legislative internships and is the chair of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you for Dr. Beller, and thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Well, I'll start by saying that I enjoy unstructured discussions. And so if you have questions or comments at any point, please just chime in. That's completely fine. I had organized the talk for today to start with what's less interesting and then progress to what I think is most interesting. That being the House of Representatives, followed by a discussion of the US Senate races, and then West Virginia's legislative races and the amendments that are on the ballot. That said, if you have a different order for what you would like to discuss today, I'm game for whatever you want to do. So are there any questions or comments before we get started? None? Okay. Can you all see on your screen the website 270 to win with the House forecasts? Is that the screen you're able to see right now? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm starting with this because it's the it's projected to be the least exciting of the collective races that we have. I wanted you all to have these websites because things are changing fairly rapidly now in terms of polls in individual races. And I thought you might want to copy these websites into your own browsers, especially for election night, to start looking at how things are shaking up. There are 3 basic websites that I use the most for national elections. This is 270 to win, but there's also Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, which we'll get to in a minute. And then there's 538.com. As all of you are familiar, I'm sure, in order to get the presidency, a candidate needs to have 270 electoral college votes. And that's where the name 270 to win comes in. But this website also tracks House and Senate races. The other is 538. When you take in all the electoral college votes, that's what we get. We divide it by 2 to get the 270, hence the names of both of those websites. But what I wanted to show you, starting off with the forecast for the House of Representatives, is that on a district level, this is fairly amazingly one-sided as it looks right now. So currently the Democratic Party has control of both the House and the Senate. It barely controls the Senate, and we'll discuss that. But the projections are that we're going to have a big flip, and that after next Tuesday, that it's going to prepare to turn over control of the House to the Republican Party. So looking at these forecasts, I wanted you to have this map. And I also want to say 4 things about this. The projections that we're looking at, a lot of these deal with national polls. Now, here's why that's, in my opinion, silly. These races for the House of Representatives are not national. They're not even statewide. They're district-wide. And each state has multiple districts. As you know, West Virginia used to have 3 districts. At one point, our population in this state was so big that we had 6 congressional districts. We're now down to 2. But for all of these states that you're looking at with the map, these races are individual district races. So national polls don't apply when we're looking at district specific races. The second comment that I want to make is that we're finding increasingly that people are not necessarily honest in polls. When people are supporting candidates that they don't believe are going to be popular with the pollster, sometimes they're not truthful. And so we're finding, and we've found this especially in presidential elections over the past 3 elections, that people aren't necessarily honest when they answer polls. Therefore, I think we should take this information with a grain of salt rather than taking it as a fait accompli. The third point I want to make with this House race is that turnout is everything. Turnout matters. In fact, it's the only thing that matters, because a lot of us are going to answer pollsters, maybe truthfully, maybe not truthfully. We can voice our opinions all day long, but if we don't turn out to vote, our opinions don't really count for anything because they're not going to affect change. So what these polls don't know yet is who's going to turn out to vote and exactly how they're going to vote. Historically, Americans really dislike Congress. Both the House and the Senate always get low approval ratings. Most Americans have terrible thoughts about both houses. And yet, in those very same surveys, we tend to really love our individual senators and representatives. And so it depends, I would suggest, on the question the pollster is asking as to whether or not we have a certain preference for a party or preference for who we're going to vote for. Because at the end of the day, regardless of party, most Americans tend to feel that they have a sort of relationship, especially with members in the House of Representatives. And a lot of that is because House and Senate members have a privilege called franking. And so when you get lots of newsletters and bulletins and emails from your members of Congress and the Senate, that's all part of their mailing privilege. And because they're able to send you a lot of mail talking about what they're doing and their viewpoints, we tend to feel that we have a special relationship with those representatives. And therefore, they have an incumbent advantage. And so a lot of these seats that are projected to switch from blue to red might very well do that. But we need to wait till the people actually turn out, because at the end of the day, as I say, traditionally, we tend to really like and feel that we have relationships with the people that serve us, particularly in the House, but also the Senate. So with that, if you have any questions about the House, I'll be more than happy to answer them. As it looks like right now, we're in for a big change, switching over to Republican control. Are there any questions or comments anybody has?
Yes, I have a comment.
Okay.
It's very frustrating to me that in West Virginia we have two House members. One of them never goes to anything where she's invited. The other one is under 2 ethics exams. Yeah. And it's so frustrating that people who look at this think they have no chance because these candidates have a lot of money. And unfortunately, that has worked out. That has been true. And the predictions are that it will stay that way. And that's just a comment. I'd like to hear you comment on it.
Money talks increasingly. What we did find out in 2020 was that there were a handful of races in which the person who raised the least amount of money actually won the election. And so it is possible to do that. I would say that in the state of West Virginia, really for the last, I don't know, I'd say going back to 2004, probably, the Democratic Party has not been terribly organized. It has been full of factions that did not work to support one another. In West Virginia, the party switched leadership this year. We now have 2 brand new leaders in that party, and I expect change moving forward. Right now, the party has not raised a lot of money to support its candidates. The candidate that's running against Congressman Mooney has served in city council in Morgantown before, but otherwise doesn't have a lot of political experience. Lacey Watson has run before, so he's experienced in that manner, but the party just hasn't raised a whole lot of money for their candidates. I expect that to change moving forward. The party really fell apart, quite honestly, when Senator Obama got the nomination. Race is a big thing in West Virginia, and county offices suddenly didn't support a national ballot. Rather, they would project that West Virginians should vote Democratic for local elections, but not necessarily national ones. And that kind of discussion is something that we in this talk room understand, because most of us are political junkies anyway. But for people who aren't terribly political, it's very difficult to follow a party that isn't unified and has mixed messages. The Republican Party is a brilliant party in terms of being unified and having one voice. And that works very, very well with people who don't regularly follow politics. So I agree with you, Betty. I think what we've got right now is a sort of a fatalistic view in terms of challenging power, but I don't expect that that's going to be the case moving forward. And I think the Democratic Party is regrouping. I also think when we get down to a discussion of West Virginia legislative races, we've got a handful of different third-party candidates who are running. And we may see some change with the parties as those candidates and their parties build. The Democrats and Republicans may need to look toward those movements, because they certainly signify that people in the state aren't totally satisfied with the power structure that we have.
Professor Beller, a follow-up question in relation to what Betty is raising as far as basic understanding from your perspective as a political scientist. The role of monies in and where the monies come from. I try to pay attention to this concept about what's called the dark money, and
Yes.
and then the PACs and so forth. Could you give us just an elementary basic understanding of what that critical issue is in
Sure.
relation to funding?
Right.
I don't mean for you to have to digress, but it's just Betty's question is so insightful, because I think that's the meat of what seems to be frustrating.
Right. The Supreme Court has ruled that money is equivalent to free speech. And with that, it opened the door for lots of organizations to have the power to have their own campaigns that are separate from party level campaigns or candidate level campaigns. And so what we're seeing with what's called dark money are organizations that do all kinds of social media advertising. They do a lot of radio and billboard and television ads, and they're paid for separately and not, at least legally, connected to any candidate or party. Not only that, but members of these organizations don't have to publicly disclose their names. And so we see a lot of organizations that have what I like to call Hallmark card titles, right?
Mhm.
Citizens for the betterment of our children. Well, how would you fight a name like that, right? It's right out of Hallmark, but that may or may not be related at all to what the organization actually does. And that's that dark money that is really endless. There are caps on what individuals can contribute to parties, what we can contribute to specific candidate races. There are caps on what parties can spend. There's no cap on this dark money. And legally, organizations don't have to disclose who their contributors are. So it is frightening. If you'll give me a second. Well, somewhere in here that I've got a book on this that I actually require my campaigns and elections class to read, because you always have to follow the money. The only hope that I see out of this is the fact that in 2020, we did have a few key races in which the person who didn't raise the most money actually won, which means that people are having a backlash to this. I will, Elizabeth, I will find that book after the discussion and send it to you so you can send the title out to everybody to read, because it's really a good study of this. The other thing that
And thank you for addressing that. Thank
Sure,
you. Thank
yeah.
you.
The other thing I would suggest, though, is another study, and this book is called Money Matters. You can look it up. It's a good book. It's now a couple of decades old, but it's still relevant. It's a study of why people vote. And what the authors found in Money Matters is that aside from all the radio, TV ads, the social media blitzes, if a candidate or a candidate's designee actually knocks on somebody's door, that makes all the difference in the world, because the individual opening the door recognizes that that campaign or candidate values them and feels that they are worthy of a discussion. And so in Money Matters, the authors conclude that it doesn't actually take millions of dollars to win an election if you're willing to put in the foot traffic. To knock on people's doors, to talk to them about why the election's important and why your candidate should have their support. So that's another study that at least gives me hope. Are there any other questions about the House that you all have before we move to the Senate? Okay, with that then, let's see here. I'm gonna show you this real quickly because this is another website that I think you'll want to keep in touch with. This is Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball. I have also put links to these sites in the chat, so you can copy and paste them to your own browser. Larry Sabato is a political scientist who specializes in elections. His work is very well regarded, and I use this site regularly. What Sabato has done here, and I've got it clicked on the House, but he also does the same with Senate races, gubernatorial races, but he actually breaks down what the polls say for specific elections. So you could go to any district that you're interested in and see coded blue obviously means that more likely we're going to have the Democrat win. Coded red looks more likely for the Republican candidate. But I think these are really interesting, specifically if you're looking at individual races. The numbers that are important to know. Right now, in order to control the House of Representatives, one party must have 218 seats. So what we're looking at as it stands now, the safe seats for the Republicans are projected to be 187. But when you combine the races that are safe for Republicans, as well as those that are likely or leaning Republican, it moves up to 219. And that's why the pollsters are predicting that we're going to see Republican control of the House after Tuesday's election. If you toggle on down, the seats that are considered safe for Democratic candidates are 154. If you add to those safe seats, those that are likely or leaning Democratic, that number only goes up to 196. And that's why most of the pollsters are saying the House is already going to shift, and they're not seeing a lot of likelihood that it would stay under Democratic control. The Senate, however, is really where it's at. That's where the fun's going to be. And the Senate's probably why very few of us are going to sleep Tuesday night. As it turns out, the Senate, as you know, right now is 50-50. There are actually only 48 Democrats in the Senate, but there are 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats. And that's how we get that number up to 50-50. The Constitution allows the Vice President to come in and break a tie. Since the President and Vice President both belong to the Democratic Party, that's why we can say that the Senate is under Democratic control right now. But it's very, very close. This site was updated, you can see, this morning at 9:56. The projections look like it could go to the Republicans, but that said, it's really still considered a toss-up for several different reasons. As of this morning, the polls were looking really good in Georgia for the Democratic incumbent. It looks like he's moving into a safe position, but that race has been a toss-up for many months. So I wouldn't consider anything to be considered safe in Georgia for either party right now. Here's what's fascinating to me. Out of all the seats, and there are 35 different Senate seats that are up. You probably know everybody in the House is up for re-election every 2 years, but every 2 years, only 1/3 of the Senate seats are up. And the founders did this so that we would have some historical continuity moving forward. So of the 35 seats that are up in the Senate right now, all of those re-elections look like they are safe, except for 11. So this election actually boils down to only 11 states. And I find that absolutely fascinating and somewhat frightening. But the reason that I wanted to give you this website, 538.com, is because the organization of it, I think, is fascinating. Number one, it's they have this color code, but then going down, you can see over the trend of months how election probabilities have shifted. We're just looking at, if you can see this October 1, it looks like the Democrats are doing very, very well. And it's just in the last week that this has shifted to look like Republicans may have an advantage. So things are absolutely mobile in the Senate. Nobody knows exactly how this is going to turn out. But this 538.com goes down to this table, which I really, really like. This is a probability table. And so, for example, if we take just that top line, right now in Pennsylvania, we've got Fetterman versus Mehmet Oz. Right now, chances are 53 and 100 that John Fetterman is going to take that seat. If you're looking at the Georgia election that I just referenced, this still has it 58 and 100 that Herschel Walker is going to take the seat. Although a new poll that just came out this morning that I listened to on NPR said that Warnock was up in polls by more than 5 percentage points, which is pretty good. But this enables you to go through all of the different elections and to look at what the polls are predicting. Clearly, the higher the number is, the more the seat is looked at as being safe for one party or another. So for example, looking here at Missouri, Schmidt is predicted in 99 out of 100 possibilities. When we go down here to Oregon, it's wide in 99 and 100. So you can look at this to see how safe or unsafe given seats are going to be. Of note, I would point out that in Utah, the Democratic Party decided not to have a nomination. Instead, the Democratic Party went behind the independent McMullin. So the incumbent Lee is still considered a win for that seat, but I think it's very instructive that Democrats did not try to recruit a Democratic candidate in that state. So as you look at this, I wanted to make a couple comments about what we might expect moving forward. As it stands now, the Democratic Party controls the House and the Senate. However, that's kind of in paper only, because in the Senate, we have 2 senators that don't always vote with their party. One of those, of course, is our own Joe Manchin. The other is Kyrsten Sinema. And because those 2 senators very frequently do not vote with their party, it's been very difficult for President Biden to get a lot of his proposed legislation passed. So a lot of discussion in the media right now centers particularly around the power that Senator Manchin has and what power he might have after Tuesday. Senator Manchin has a lot of power because he's considered to be a swing vote and because the Senate right now is 50-50. Projections are not that it's going to stay 50-50. The Democrats may win a few seats, the Republicans might win a few seats, but the pollsters are expecting a change in one direction or another. If it changes any way other than 50-50, then Senator Manchin loses a lot of power in terms of being that broker that may vote with the Republicans or may vote in a Democratic manner. But I would suggest that whether or not we have more seats that are Democratic or whether or not power shifts to the Republican Party, Senator Manchin is still going to be really relevant and very important. Right now, he's the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. If Republicans take power in the Senate, Senator Manchin is still going to be the ranking member, meaning the most dominant member in his party. That still is very influential. Senator Manchin also sits on other committees with veterans, with other resources. I've got a list here of all of his committees: Veterans Affairs, Armed Services, Appropriations. So when a lot of the pundits talk about Joe Manchin losing power, he'll lose power in terms of being a broker. But he's not going to lose influence as far as the committees that he sits on And those committees are very helpful still to West Virginians. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It is because largely, I think Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin can't be counted on to be voters with their party, that we haven't seen a lot go through under the Biden administration. So if it looks like the House is going to go Republican, the Senate may or may not. I'm just suggesting that we're still not going to see a smooth ride either way for the Biden administration, because the Biden administration has already had a lot of opposition coming out of the Senate. It's just going to have a different degree of opposition. Does that make sense? Are there any questions or comments that you have about the Senate? Okay, with that, if you do, we can come back to any of these races. I did want to talk about West Virginia's elections. And this website is the Secretary of State of West Virginia. They do a really good job with their website of giving us all of the different candidates that are running for the various offices. And so while the Secretary of State is not tracking polling data, that is not their business, they will actually change this website to show you the results of the election within about 10 to 14 days after that election, because they wait until all of the clerk's offices have canvassed their election, have recounted to make certain that we don't have any upsets in the way the ballots were counted before they make it official. So you can look for this website to change again within 10 to 14 days of the actual election. But here's what I found in perusing this website. And I find this, I'll editorialize here, I find this disturbing. There are 2 seats in the Senate that are uncontested from the Democrats. They didn't even recruit anybody. In the House of Delegates, there are 22 seats in which the Democrats did not put forward a candidate. I find that very, very bad for democracy, because I think when we look at democracy, power should always be challenged. We should always have discussions about alternative ideas, alternative ways of seeing things. In the House of Delegates, we have 100 seats. For 22 of those seats not to be challenged by the second largest party in the state, it is, I mean, that's over a fifth. And so I find that to be really discouraging. But I did find something that's kind of interesting to me. There are 12 seats. Let me find my notes for you. There are 12 seats in the House, and including one in the Senate, actually, in which we have third-party candidates running. And this is really interesting. You may be familiar with the Mountain Party. It's existed now for nearly 2 decades. The Mountain Party has 2 candidates running for the House. The Libertarian Party has 2 candidates running in the Senate and 2 in the House. Independents have 1 running in the Senate and 2 in the House. And then in a race that is looking at challenging Charlie Trump, Trump is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. There is somebody that is challenging him, and that person is from a party that's called West Virginia Upwising, UPWISING. And so to register as a third party, you have to get enough petitioners in the state that the Secretary of State will recognize you. And so when we look at that, it was there. So let me go to Charlie Trump's yeah, here he is. senatorial district right here. You can see here's Charles Trump, and the person running against him in Senate District 15 is from Uprising, West Virginia. So that's a new party to look at in this state. But by my count, we have 12 different people from third parties running in the House and the Senate. And that's kind of interesting from a Democratic small d point of view, that we have new voices, new ideas coming into the mix.
I'd like to ask a question
Yes,
regarding so few Democrats in different districts.
yes.
I wonder if the redistricting, in the way it was done, purposely cut the Democrats. I'm thinking of the district that's Rick Griffith is in, and I can't remember the other Democrat who was pitted against him for the primary. They both were in different districts before. They're both excellent, but
Yes,
only one of them could make it. So it was a way of making sure that really the popular Democrats just weren't going to be able to be reelected.
Yes.
yeah, this is the first time that West Virginia's House has gone to all single member districts. And you're right, the way the districts were crafted pitted several incumbent Democrats against one another. And it was a successful effort to weed out Democratic candidates. That is true. The other thing that I would suggest is that it's very difficult to run a campaign and to raise the money. Parties do not put money behind their candidates in the primary. In the primary, every candidate is on his or her own as far as party money and party support. It's after the primary that the parties are supposed to get right behind their nominees and help them financially and help them to get out the vote. The Democratic Party has been sort of in a quasi-depression for a lot of years. And it has centered its money and resources around congressional and senatorial races more than legislative races. With the new leadership that's come to the Democratic Party, I suspect we're going to see a big change in that in coming years. Because Mike Pushkin, who chairs the party now, is in the House. The vice chair of the Democratic Party now is Danielle Walker, who's also in the House. And so these people understand the importance of legislative races. And so I think we're going to see changes moving forward. But yes, it's been a big setback this year, pitting a lot of incumbents against one another. One thing that's going to be very interesting, Barbara Evans Fleischhauer, if you look at Senatorial District 13, Fleischhauer has been in the House for many, many years. She's from Monongalia County, and she's very progressive. Because of those changes to single member districting, Evans Fleischhauer decided to move, and now she is running in the Senate. Her opposition is Mike Oliverio. Oliverio is a Republican. He has served in the legislature before for many years, so he's also well known. The last bid that Oliverio had was to try to get the nomination against Congressman Mooney. He lost in that election a couple of years ago. And so I bring this forward by saying Oliverio does have a following, and he's got a lot of political experience. So it's going to be interesting to see how that race turns out. Another thing that I found interesting, I looked at the districts that were uncontested, and as it turns out, 5 of our counties in West Virginia had 2 House of Delegates districts in which there was no contest. 4 of those are solidly Republican candidates. Those are Mason County, Raleigh, Upshur, and Berkeley. The fifth county, however, was Cabell, which is our own. And in Cabell County, we had 2 members who are running uncontested, but they're from different parties. One is Linville, Dan Linville's of the Republican Party, he's an incumbent, but the other is Sean Hornbuckle, who had a big presence as a student at Marshall University and has been in the House for many years now. And Sean was uncontested. So that is the only uncontested Democrat that I found in the legislature. But I thought it was interesting that those 5 counties would not have any nominees from the opposite party for those specific districts. Any comments or questions about legislative races?
Mary Beth, I think, whoops, sorry. I'm sorry. I think that the redistricting not only purposely pitted incumbents against each other, but also purposely had certain districts arranged so that, because it's so important where you live to run in the House, particularly because
Yes,
they're such small districts, a lot of this was done purposely too.
of course.
And
Of
maybe
course.
think about that.
Sure. No, it's no secret that we have a lot of legislative gerrymandering.
Yes.
I will say that while the House and the Senate right now have a supermajority of Republican control, that gerrymandering is not unknown to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, when it was in control for many years, did a pretty good job of gerrymandering itself. So I can't say that this is only a Republican thing. This is something that the party in power does when it can get away with it, quite
Yeah,
honestly.
that's right.
So
Forever.
yeah, it's just the way it goes. Many states have tried to craft ways to get away from gerrymandering, and they have committees that are chosen to look at the map, and when the new census data come in every 10 years, to try to refigure new districts without political influence. You all may remember Bobby Nelson, who had a radio show in Huntington for many years. Bobby and I spent a whole hour arguing about this because I thought that having an independent commission could help with some of this gerrymandering problem. Bobby's contention, and let's face it, he's right, is that it's the party that and the governor that influences who's appointed to that commission. So you can never entirely get away from politics. And I take his point. I thought it might be worth a try in West Virginia, but we're not there yet. So yeah, there is gerrymandering. There are actually states in the United States in which the legislature is controlled by Democrats, and they've gerrymandered the seats to pretty much predict a Democratic outcome. So it's the way our politics goes. This can only be challenged in the court, and you have to have pretty firm evidence of gerrymandering, and that sometimes that's hard to prove. Anything else about West Virginia's legislature? The Republicans have a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. While we might see Democrats pick up a couple of seats, nobody suspects that the leadership is going to change. So we can pretty much guarantee that those houses are both safe for Republican control after Tuesday.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't the independent candidates want to register as Democrats? Because, you know, as a lifelong Democrat, I don't understand that. I'll be honest.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. If you look at it, and I've actually got these numbers here. Right now in West Virginia, I think this breakdown is fascinating. 38.7% of West Virginia voters are registered Republican. 34.11% are registered Democrats, and 27.19% are registered independents. I would suggest that increasingly our parties have both become very, very polarized. And so not only in employment circles, even though it's illegal, in employment circles, people who are of the wrong party have always had a fear that something might happen to their employment status. Certainly in terms of social clubs, even families at Thanksgiving are finding it very, very difficult in this hyper polarized atmosphere to deal with the fact that some of us simply disagree on our policy preferences. And so I think increasingly a lot of us register as independent because it's safer. It's safer. It stops the polarization in conversations. And people are not going to be prejudiced against by having the wrong party. We hear anecdotal evidence of kids being hurt in their sports leagues if their parents have the wrong political party. We have a lot of, and as I say, it's anecdotal, it's hearsay, but that doesn't mean that the fear isn't palpable. So one of my answers, Bert, is that we're so partisan that being independent is simply safe. The other thing I would suggest is that a lot of people are simply turned off to political parties. They want to participate, but there are elements of both the Democratic and Republican parties that people find objectionable. One of the things that makes American politics unique and that we don't really see in other democracies is that in American politics, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are big umbrella parties in which they have policy positions for issues that aren't necessarily related, right? Environmental issues and abortion. How do you reconcile those under one ideology? You really can't. And yet, the way our parties are formed, we're umbrellas where we have several positions on very different issues. So it's hard for people who might prefer the policy preference of one party on one issue, but be aligned with another party on a different issue. And for those people, if they can't reconcile themselves to be under the Republican umbrella or the Democratic umbrella, it's simply safer to be independent. Now, to get back to your point on why their candidates are running as independents, I don't know that answer. What I do know is that in very few circumstances do we see an independent winning an election. It can happen. We have 2 United States senators, right, that are independent. So it can happen. What typically happens is that if there's an independent, the person of the established party typically wins the race. If it's a 3-person race, the independent's ideology that is closer to the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate siphons off votes from that party, thereby tilting the election to the opposite party. So that's the history of what happens with those.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments about the legislative races? I thought if you wanted to, that we could get into the thorny matter of the 4 amendments, but that's only if you want to. I understand that this is a very polarizing matter as well. But is that something you'd like to discuss?
Personally, I need help.
Okay, well, we have 4 amendments on the ballot. And the first amendment is one that's interesting to me because it's not getting any real traction anywhere in newspapers. The West Virginia State Constitution says that the House of Delegates has the power to impeach cabinet members, the governor, and certainly members of the Supreme Court of Appeals. So our higher level offices. If someone is found or accused of wrongdoing, the Constitution gives the House the power for impeachment. If the House does impeach someone, then the Constitution gives the Senate the power to try that person. If that person is found guilty, then the person is removed from office. So the Constitution simply says that those powers lie within the House and Senate respectively. The only other thing that the Constitution says is that in the event that the Senate holds a trial, that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Appeals is going to oversee that trial. Or if the Chief Justice cannot, that the court will designate a judge to oversee that trial. All the other processes about how this is going to shake out, what the rules and regulations are up to each chamber to decide. So the House decides its own process, the Senate decides its own process. Amendment 1 says that the processes that the Senate and the House have stay within those chambers. In other words, if someone is impeached and finds that the House violated its own rules, what happens currently is that that person can challenge that violation in court to say, you all wrote the rules, but you violated them, therefore the impeachment can't stand. If Amendment 1 passes, people will no longer have that checks and balances to go to the court for redress, because the amendment says the power will stay solely now within the legislature and cannot be challenged in court. So that's what that amendment does. Amendment 2 is the one that's getting most of the traction. And it's really very interesting because the laundry list of organizations that are against this keeps growing. I have a list for you. Amendment 2 is favored strongly by the state Senate. It's also favored by the House, but the House is not in concurrence with the plan to backfill the money that would be gone. The specific amendment says that the legislature would have the power, if the amendment passes, to take away the personal property tax of businesses, as well as the business inventory tax and the tax on personal vehicles. So right now, you and I pay a tax every year on our personal vehicles. Businesses pay taxes on their personal property as well as their inventory. This amendment says that the legislature would have the power to control those taxes, including taking them away. Now, the plan in the legislature is to take away those taxes, and they're advertising very heavily about that. The reason this is controversial is that the money from those taxes doesn't go to the state. It goes to the counties and to the municipalities. And that's how the counties and municipalities fund their fire departments, how their EMS, their ambulance services. It's how they fund their police departments. It's how they fund their libraries. And it also goes to supplement local schools outside of the state funding formula. So if this amendment passes and the legislature decides to take away those taxes, then all of those things that are funded on a local level will no longer have mechanisms to fund themselves. which means one of two things. The state is going to have to find a mechanism to fund those services that we depend on, or states and localities are going to have to raise revenue in different ways to pay for those services. So as it stands now, the Senate has released a plan to backfill that money to the counties and to the cities. One of the difficulties is that the Senate plan rests on a flat budget for years going out. The budget can't be flat in years going out. PEIA has already announced. PEIA, by the way, is the health insurance for state employees. It's already announced it's $92 million in the hole. So that's just one area where we're going to have to find some new revenue. The second difficulty with the Senate's plan is that the House of Delegates doesn't concur with the plan on how to backfill the money. So the bill is popular in the Senate. It hasn't been agreed to in the House. And for the past 3 weeks, as I'm sure you're familiar, Governor Justice has been touring the state talking about the fact that he wants Amendment 2 defeated. And so it's a controversial proposal. It has a lot of opposition. By my count today, 22 county commissions have come out against this. In addition to this, both teachers unions, WVEA and the AFT, have come out against it. The West Virginia Library Association has come out against it. The West Virginia Chiefs of Police have come out against it. NAACP of West Virginia has come out against it. The best analysis that I could give to you comes from the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. And if you want to go to that, it's wvpolicy.org. That is their website, wvpolicy.org. One of the analysts there, Sean O'Leary, is just a whiz at data. People disagree with his ideas. They never question his data analysis. So I would urge you to look at that website to see a breakdown of what may happen as a result of that. So that's Amendment 2. It is controversial. Most of us don't like paying taxes, but we really do like having a fire department that can come to our rescue. So who knows how that's going to shake out. Amendment 3 is actually not seen as very controversial at all. What this would do is allow churches to incorporate. What incorporation means for a church is that the church as an entity could be held responsible if anything goes wrong with the church. So if there's a mismanagement of funds, if someone gets hurt on church property, if there are inappropriate actions taken by members of the church, including the pastor. The reason this isn't controversial is that most of our churches already have filed tax status as 501c3s, meaning they're recognized as being charitable nonprofit organizations. And with that, they have insurance for the organization and for their board members. So most of the members of churches already have that protection. Another reason why this isn't controversial is that we're the last state in the union not to allow churches to incorporate. So 49 other states have already had this on the books for a long time. So it's not really seen as controversial in any way. And that leaves us with Amendment number 4. Amendment number 4 is also going to strengthen the power of the legislature, just as Amendments 1, 2, and 2 will do if they pass. Amendment 4 is going to change the power structure with the West Virginia State Board of Education. As it stands now, the State Board of Education sets state level policy through K through 12 schools. It's also in charge of hiring the state superintendent of schools. if Amendment 4 passes, what it will do is to say that any rule or policy that is promulgated by the State Board of Education will not have the effect of law until it is reviewed by the legislature. And the legislature would then have the power to agree with or affirm that rule, or to amend the rule, or to negate the rule. So it shifts the power away from the State Board of Education to the legislature for control of K through 12 education. And those are the amendments in a nutshell. Do you have any questions about them?
The League of Women Voters has a handout that takes a position on the amendments, as organizations do. And I'd be glad to send that to Elizabeth. The League takes positions on issues, does not take positions on candidates. It's strictly, carefully nonpartisan about it. And it's very interesting. And League is opposing 1, 2, and 4, and does not have a position on number 3 because we've never studied it. As you say, that's not very controversial, but and I would add on amendment number 4, theoretically at least, the regulations could change. All of the school regulations could change with the change of the legislature from year to year, and it would be a disaster to have things changing so often.
Right.
And that is one major reason to oppose that.
I'd agree with Betty, and I think number 4 is the scariest
Yeah.
of rules. Not only that, we have a legislature that can't seem to find any kind of organization among itself unless it's against something. The House and the Senate don't agree. The governor doesn't agree. And they also are only part-time legislature.
Right.
So if the schools were to wait for them or the legislature to be active and rule on something, I think it would just be disastrous. Schools have enough issues without throwing them to the legislature. So to me, that one is absolutely scary.
And I would say that Diane was a member of a board of education at one time.
Years ago.
Years ago, yes, but some things don't change very much.
Just a quick comment. I think Bill Wilson got off the call, but the United Methodist Church is strongly supporting 3 to allow churches to incorporate. So just a quick comment.
This is Skip. I wanted to comment just a moment on Amendment 3 too, and that is to say it's primarily a technical amendment because many churches already are incorporated. Our church is in the process of incorporating because there's a backdoor way to do it. This simply clears it up and brings us in line with the rest of the world.
The number 1 amendment, I think some people are referring to it as the Blue Velvet Couch Amendment. It all came about after Alan Lowry, who was on the Supreme Court, was impeached for his improper use of funds and whatever. But it also seemed, at least to me, a quick, easy way to get rid of the rest of the people on the Supreme Court who happened to be leaning Democratic.
Yes.
And it was thwarted when they had an acting Supreme Court. I don't know what we would call it because they had to bring in outside people to rule on it.
Yes.
And sort of stopped the wholesale removal of everybody from the court, though they did leave the one Republican member on. And so this was a way to totally control the Supreme Court. So if that one passes, tell me if I'm wrong, but it looks like a way that the legislature now is the top dog in the state.
It absolutely shifts power. You are correct. Because the way the amendment reads is that if anyone objects to the House or the Senate breaking their own rules, they have no recourse. And, you know, one of the things that our country has tried to maintain, whether or not it's exercised, is that at least on paper, we have a balance of power and we have the ability to have checks and balances. This would remove a check and balance. Yeah. And what happened the last time was that the House had violated its own rules. And that's why there was a lawsuit, and the appointed judge that stepped in said, you can't violate the rules. The rules are the rules, you have to stick with them. And so it caused some anger among legislators. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Well, thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. Thank you. I have enjoyed this. It'll be so much fun to see about 3 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday what's going on.
And thank you so much, because it was very informative for me.
One quick question. I know you, Mary Beth or Dr.
We
Bell.
got time. We got a few minutes. We're good.
Yeah, I have 15 minutes left.
Okay,
So I'm good.
I'll be quick. In your opinion, and if you don't want to give it, I understand, are we headed toward the old James Carville statement of it's the economy stupid that he made in '92 when Clinton beat Bush with this election?
You know, that's a great question. And my answer is it depends on what is salient with the voter. Because nationally, yes, we do have an economy that is looking at inflation that's very, very hard to control. Some of that the administration can control, a lot of it isn't. Our economy affects us locally, but let's face it, it has a lot of international factors that cause price fluctuations. For those people who find it easier to blame the administration in charge, if the economy is their number one issue, then we can expect a big red wave, yes. I would suggest that the political stripe of the president doesn't actually affect the economy, but we need to blame people when we're upset. So that's what we tend to do regardless of who's in the White House. I would also suggest that there are a whole lot of people across the nation who are very, very, very upset over the Dobbs decision. And so for the people for whom abortion rights are a salient issue, we might not see this red wave happening, because with the court's decision in Dobbs, the only real recourse that people have is to change their state legislatures, but also to try to get firmer Democratic control in the House or the Senate, because the House and the Senate can pass legislation saying that there is a right to an abortion. So for those for whom that's a salient issue, I would expect to see Democratic votes. If inflation is the issue, it's likely to go Republican. But for each voter, there's a different issue that comes in priority, right? So I can't predict that. Yeah, what Carville said was it's the economy stupid. And you know, if you remember back, Gerald Ford inherited an administration in which inflation was going through the roof. And at the same time, unemployment was starting to rise. Typically, inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship. And suddenly we get President Ford, and he's in a position where people are upset about both. And he very famously, and to his detriment, said, well, everybody is affected by inflation. only some of us are affected by unemployment. And for those people who were on the unemployment side of being affected, it didn't go over very well for him. But yeah, we're all dealing with higher prices and not a lot of recourse right now as to what to do with that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, you look great. You did a great job. It was fascinating, and thank you, friend.
Well, thank you. This has been great fun.
I'm going to send out to everyone the sites that Mary Beth included and any books that Betty, did you have something you wanted to send to me to send out?
Yes, I will. Send
Okay,
it.
get that to me and I'll put it all together in an email just so we can have all these resources at our
And I will
fingertips.
find that book on dark money because it's
Okay,
really
it's
a
in-
good read.
Okay, and send that to me. Again, I'll just put it all together in an
Okay.
email.
Cool.
Well, thank you.
Hey,
Are there any?
thank you all. I've enjoyed this.
Well, we've enjoyed it and I got to hear this again. Mary Beth spoke at Rotary this week and it was so great. I'm like, oh, you've got to speak to the LLP because it's just, you just know the topic and you present it in such a great manner. So thank you so much for meeting with us today. And thank you for everyone that was able to come and join us.
Yes, and I think it might be interesting at some time in the future if Mary Beth would come back and do an update of where we are.
Yes, I thought the same thing. And we'll do that. Mary Beth, were you willing?
Oh, I would be very happy to do that.
Okay, and
I-
Bert,
I
you have,
would suggest we need to wait. For some of these races, we're not going to know what's going on.
Right.
No, it'll be a while.
So I would give it a few weeks.
okay, sure.
We're likely to have some recounts.
Yep.
Even in West Virginia, we had some seats that were won literally by a handful of votes. And in most states, when the vote is that close, it triggers an automatic recount. In other cases, candidates are allowed to ask for recounts, but must agree to pay for the cost of those. So regardless, I'd give it a few weeks after.
Bert, you have a question? You're muted. You're muted.
No, I didn't have a question. I just sent an applause.
Oh, okay. All
no.
right. Well, thank you. Well, I think we all can agree on that one.
Yeah, I was
All
just-
right. We will, Mary Beth, if you'll just let me know when you think everything's in and we'll make a time to meet again. How's that sound?
That sounds like fun.
Okay. And again,
This is what I do.
Mary, right, just get those things to me, the books, whatever it is you want me to share with everyone, and I'll put it in Betty too, and I'll put it in an email to everyone. So thank you so much. I know your schedule's tight today, so thank you for working this in.
Sure. Okay.
All right.
You guys take care. Make
Everyone
sure
have
you
a great
vote.
day. Yes, thank you.
Please vote.
Actually, I voted early.
Yay, good for
The
you.
student center, it's right here in the student center, makes it very convenient. So, all
Nice.
right, everyone, have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.